Welcome to this module on transforming to the next generation digital supply chain, the people side. My name is Ulrike Schultze. I am a faculty member in the ITOM department here at Cox. I tend to be very interested in issues of organizational change as a result of information technology. In particular, I'm always interested in how work practices change, how people's sense of identity and their roles and professional identity change as a result of technology. So this topic of the people side of digital transformation is very near and dear to my heart. So what I'd like to cover today then is, first of all, what do we mean by digital transformation? A lot of you might have heard of the notion of change management, especially if you've been involved in supply chain management implementations and ERP implementations over the years. There's frequently a change management component, and so the question is, is change management all there is when we're starting to talk about transformation, digital transformation? So really trying to look at, what's in a name, what's in the name transformation that might be different from change management. I think one of the things that's interesting is this tension that we frequently see between, is digital transformation really about technology or is it about people? And so there's a very recent article that I think is interesting in this regard, where the argument is it's really about people. It's about the talent that in your organization that allows you to be successful with digital transformation or not. But one of the key things that I think is interesting is that we have figured out, how to create flexible infrastructures on the technology side. I don't think we've figured out how to create flexible infrastructures on the people side. And so that's a key piece of what I'd like us to be thinking about today as I go through this material. So first of all, what is digital transformation? I like this idea from the book, which is, Designing for Digital, which I can highly recommend, that really what digital transformation implies is a redesign of your business. That implies that you worry about, the entire configuration of people, of processes, and of technology. And all of this with an eye to enhancing the value proposition for your customers. Sometimes it's about coming up with a new value proposition. So for example, if we think about, artificial intelligence and predicting our delivery of goods of goods in a supply chain, or the ability of customers to receive very customized offers. If you order this item to be delivered between 3 and 3:30 tomorrow, then you will get an XYZ discount, right? Those supply chain issues. Of course, when we think about autonomous vehicles, right, there's a whole series of value propositions associated with that, you sort of robotic warehousing, right? So there's a key concern always is, how do we serve the customer better? And the idea with digital transformation is that we essentially take digital technologies and that, AI, data warehousing, analytics, the ability to communicate via mobile these days, and do very fast interactions between individual customers and us as a company. All of that is part of what's important within this realm of digital transformation. And so, again, you've most probably heard about change management in the past. And so these are, a set of activities frequently associated with training, with communicating, with motivating people in the organization to become prepared for a new set of technologies. And so, change management was frequently part of large implementations, ERP type implementations, supply chain management implementations. It was all about planning, how to get ready, how to get people ready for this technological change that was coming down the pike. There was a clear sense of, this is the state we're in now as a company, and this is the state we want to be in as a company. And so we've got to, unfreeze people from their current state, move them, and then refreeze them in a new state. So the question is transformation the same? Is transformation just change management? And my sense is that it isn't. That really what transformation implies is that it's about preparing the organization or creating an organization that is able to respond nimbly, that is able to deal with any kinds of external shocks, changes in new technologies, changes in your competitor's position. So it really is about effectively responding to changes in the environment to a large extent. And so it really is about becoming responsive, being adept, and thinking about the organization, not in terms of sort of an entity, but much more in terms of a flow. And what the organization becomes in terms of the business model design, right? That is in a constant state of becoming, as opposed to very well established and very well understood and known. We're here now and we need to be there in 2 years' time, right? It's sort of what happens in 2 years' time is really quite ambiguous, and what the situation is going to be is really quite unknown. So how do we deal with this? And I think it's through the ability to respond and be adaptive. So to me, that's really the crux of transformation. Now, I indicated earlier on that when it comes to digital transformation, we have some clear ideas of what companies are doing to essentially ready themselves for this rather ambiguous world that they're entering into, and to get their technology to a place that it can respond nimbly and adaptively, to changes. And so the way we think about this is that technology is arranged in layers. And we typically think about 3 layers here. And of course, in reality, things are way more complicated than this. But I think as a metaphor, this is a very powerful set of concepts. So typically organizations that are successful with digital transformation have developed what is called an operational backbone. And what that means is those are the transaction processing systems that keep the lights on, and that they have been completely wired with one another. So, if you're changing a customer record, because a customer has moved and now needs to have the goods delivered somewhere else, right? That one change is made once, and all other systems that are affected by it are updated automatically. And so that's sort of the notion of the operational backbone. The digital service platform is what essentially allows, for the flexibility and for the supercharging, through digital transformation. So this is where we've got our data warehouse, for example, and our AI and all sorts of other systems that essentially allow multiple services, right? Sort of think of the services as apps, to be running on our platform. And these apps could be developed by third parties. And so specifically in sort of the logistics space, right? You've got, a need sometimes to integrate between different companies wanting to deliver goods. And so this idea of we can share a truck, right? To sort of deliver different companies' goods into the same area, right, into the same direction. And so the sharing of trucking capacity, for example, right, those would all be apps typically that are developed by one company or another. And so our ability to then integrate those apps into all the way down to our operational backbone, right, that is enabled by the APIs and all sorts of other integration technologies in the digital services platform. Also analytics, that essentially allow for better optimization of delivery and also warehousing. All of those things basically would be residing in this digital services platform. And so this is, some people refer to this as the stack, but this is a very common technological way of organizing, right? Sort of a way of organizing in the technological space that, has been established as a way of being nimble. Now, what I think is interesting about this layered form of organizing is its contrast to what most of us are way more familiar with, which is the hierarchical way of organizing. So hierarchical way of organizing, which is how most organizations essentially arrange themselves, implies a top-down decomposition. And what a top-down decomposition ultimately means, in terms of specializations, is that, whatever our product or service is, has to be known in advance. And once I know what that is, I can then decompose it into components, and then identify the specializations that I need for each of those components. And that's sort of how we think about, how sort of the hierarchical way of organizing. These are some of the key assumptions underlying it. And then also, how do we cluster things into one vertical in a hierarchy? Well, it's typically because of interdependence and, the need for coordination. So, the more things have to be coordinated, the more interdependent they are, the more likely they are to be organized into one vertical. So how does this compare then with a layered architecture? It seems to be lying on its side. So what does this imply? Well, it implies what we call a core periphery model, or a way of thinking, or a platform periphery model, where the platform is really sort of the bottom layer, right? And so where we do not need to know the product we want to build, or what the final product needs to be. We don't need to know it ahead of time. All we need to know is what are the components that are going to be universally used and that need to be stable. So, so in the case of an organization, right, we might think about this as the culture, right? The culture of the organization is something that needs to be solid, that needs to be reusable, that basically permeates everything that sits above it, right? Or if we think about technology, then frequently it's the hardware, right? Sort of the hardware is something that we want to keep quite stable, because of course all the software operating systems running on top of it, apps running on top of it, right? They would basically have to run on this hardware. So we'd want that to remain stable, to have a stable environment. Now, of course, what's interesting about this, so what we've got here then is a mode of organizing, the layered mode of organizing is one that allows us flexibility. Because what we're saying is, as long as we have the bottom layers established and they're, reusable and stable, then the things on top, right, sort of the services, the apps on top, actually can be very flexible. So I can take an app from a third party and, plug it in, and it'll work with my entire stack, right? And so hierarchy, again, assumes I know what my final product is, and I can keep that stable, and then I organize, right, my verticals. Whereas layered says, all I know is, what stays stable, what has to stay stable, what gets reused, what is often used, and then the stuff that isn't moves to the periphery, right? And the periphery complements, builds on and complements this bottom layer, the stuff that remains stable. So why is this interesting for thinking about how do we build a flexible people organization? Well, there's a theory about organizing that is called the mirroring hypothesis. And what it basically says is that organizations, the people side of organizations, mirrors the products that the organization produces. So, you know, if we manufacture a car, then essentially if we subdivide this into components, you know, that's the chassis, at the engine, you know, the sort of all the other components, the body, for example, then essentially we develop people organizations that mirror, you know, that knowledge. Now, the mirroring hypothesis doesn't have to be causal, or is not considered causal in the sense of you develop products and then the people organization follows. You might actually think about it the other way too. And this is frequently something that we see in software, that the way the organization is structured, right, the software team is structured, that's how the modules in the software split out. So essentially, it's just a correlation rather than a causal relationship. But essentially, again, if we, what's interesting about this is then if we know what a flexible technological architecture looks like, how can we think about a mirrored people architecture, right? That sort of mirrors this. And I think what we're starting to see in organizations these days is something that looks like the following. First of all, you know, increasing efforts are made to work in self-managed project teams. So in software development, we call them agile teams. And the idea is that these are, you know, it's a cross-functional team. You know, you've got customers, you've got people with various specialization in these teams, and they complete their work in a, you know, in a sort of a very fast fashion, right, where they fail fast. They, you know, sort of, they get continuous feedback from their customers in order to establish, you know, are we developing the right thing? Let's not waste any time. Let's not reinvent the wheel, right? So you've got the sort of cross-pollination of different specializations, you know, that is occurring there. So that's, you know, the flexibility, the high flexibility. That's one attempt that we're seeing. I think another way to think about, you know, what really has to stay stable in the organization, earlier on I already mentioned culture. So, you know, do you have a culture that allows for experimentation, that says it's okay to make mistakes, for example, you know, or is this one where senior management always has the final say versus, you know, the self-managed teams have a lot of their own autonomy to make decisions. Then, of course, I would say that the organizational hierarchy, the way we have identified specializations, most probably sits there too. So I doubt that we'll ever get rid of the hierarchy completely. However, there are companies like Spotify, for example, that have, you know, really pushed that most organizing to be done in these self-managed teams. And still, you will need back office and managerial operations that are sometimes, you know, in some way still going to look like a hierarchy. So I think organizational hierarchies are most probably going to stay. And then we've got practices, you know, sort of our practices of hiring, our practices of assessing performance, right? Those are practices that, you know, need to be consistent. People need to know, you know, that this is going to stay relatively stable. And so, for example, one of the things that we keep hearing about, you know, with regard to becoming more flexible as an organization, is to think about hiring for potential and hiring as opposed to, you know, what has the person done in the past? It's more, what do we think the person can do in the future, right? So hiring for potential rather than past performance. And then also hiring for curiosity, hiring, you know, for being a self-starter, that those things become increasingly important when you're expecting people to be adaptive and changeable in an ongoing kind of way. And so then the question that, you know, comes up is, okay, so what would be this middle, right? Sort of what would be the thing that connects the, you know, very stable back office operations to this much more nimble way of organizing at the top? And some of the ideas that are coming to light here are, you know, to essentially make it clear to individuals that managing their career is really the individual responsibility. However, we are going to give you tools to do that, right? So one of the things that you can expect, I guess, in a in a supply chain that is moving to the next generation of digital is that, you know, with self-driving trucks, with robotic warehousing, with dispatching that's going to be increasingly automated, you know, you're going to have a lot of people that have, you know, years and years of experience in these various functions that no longer, you know, have a place. However, do you really want to lose them, or do you want to figure out a way of reskilling them? Because, you know, as much as we say about how smart technology is, there's so much embodied knowledge in people, especially when they work with physical things and in physical spaces, that, you know, it's unlikely that the technology is going to be able to perform those tasks as well as people can. So to some extent, then, we need to think about what knowledge we want to maintain, what skills we want to keep in the organization. And so things like allowing people tools to figure out, you know, what could I be learning to upgrade my skills so that I have a place in this future environment of increasing automation in the supply chain. Those are things that, in my mind, would fit into this middle layer, if you want. And so I won't go into too much detail here in the interest of time, but here's some of the principles we know from Agile development, which is, you know, what I was talking about in terms of self-managed teams. One of the key insights from this is that, you know, as team members, we need to be able to change hats very quickly. And so let's say a team member is out, you know, on maternity or out ill that day, somebody else has to do the task that was assigned to this team member. And so this idea of a T-shaped skill profile is one of, okay, I have, you know, lots of knowledge in, let's say, you know, sort of distribution, right? And sort of figuring out distribution. However, I now need to help with other aspects, right? With demand forecasting, for example, in order for our team to do its project. And so that's the T, right? It's sort of knowing enough, but not having this depth of knowledge in each of those areas, but knowing enough to fill in for somebody, to keep the work moving along, right? And so I think that's sort of an interesting sort of concept, again, or metaphor to keep in mind. I think another thing that's really interesting about what we've learned about Agile teams is that people are assigned to one project at a time, and they complete that project before, you know, a new project is sort of started. So none of this, you know, running between competing priorities, right? It's sort of this one project. It's all about working very fast, delivering very quickly, failing fast, right? Those are some of the key principles. And here, I just want to pick up one thing, and that is this notion of a career lattice. So again, similar to the T-shaped skills profile, the idea, instead of, you know, developing depth in one area of specialization, which is, you know, what the career ladder was about, the idea today is to have a career lattice, which means it's lateral moves, sometimes even a downward move, right? And all of this in order to develop a sense of breadth. And so this is certainly something that, you know, I've heard from headhunters, especially executive headhunters, who are looking to place senior executives in these leadership roles for digital transformation. And the sort of metaphor they use is one of, we're looking for unicorns. We're looking for people that just have a, you know, an incredibly broad, eclectic set of skills that, you know, and experiences that provide them the potential, right? That give them the potential to lead in an environment that's incredibly fast-moving, uncertain, and ambiguous. And so I guess in terms of thinking about, you know, what is the talent, you know, how do you develop talent? How do you think about developing talent? You know, to think interdisciplinary, to think broad, to think multiple, possibly even unrelated experiences in order to prepare your organization for digital transformation. Okay, and so just to really wrap up real quick, so you know, digital transformation as being an all-encompassing reconfiguration of your organization, of your business model. That it's a constant. You need to think about it in terms of a constant change and flow, rather than very discrete. We are here and we need to be here. And what this sort of flow then implies is that we need to help you know, not only create technologies, but also people infrastructures that are capable of continuous adaptation and flexibility. And some of the ideas that I've given you here, you know, first of all, to think about the components of your people organization, right? So those are incentives, those are structures, those are, you know, practices with regard to assessment and hiring, all of those, to think about those in terms of what's the stuff that needs to stay stable, and what's the stuff that I need to support, you know, these self-managed teams that can work very flexibly, you know, at sort of, you know, actually do the work at this level of interfacing with my customers. So I hope this leaves you with some food for thought in terms of, you know, how to think about the people organization or the people side of digital transformation. Would certainly love to have more conversations with you about this, because I certainly think this is a very topical and a very important issue, especially now in the time of COVID-19, where you know, so many companies have been forced to sort of deal with this crisis and forced to really move into the space of digital transformation in a very quick way. And you know, what sort of, you know, as we come back to work, you know, how can we think about, you know, arranging our organizational structures in a way to support people, you know, in these various transitions that are obviously coming our way. All right, with that, thank you very much. Take care.